You can go from a good place to a bad place, like you can go from a really good place to a really bad place in incremental steps, and the people who are watching it can be saying, well, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Well, I would say, well, how open were your eyes? That would be one question. Did you really look? Did you really want to know? Well, no.
Jordan Peterson is a clinical psychologist and a professor at the University of Toronto.
You know, I mean, it's a pretty competitive world. There's lots of competition for young men in particular. There's competition for status and limited resources and for the attention of women. And just because you're nice doesn't necessarily mean that you come out particularly well in those competitions. You know, and there isn't any real evidence that he was particularly successful with women. And so, like, I wouldn't grant his niceness a kind of moral virtue. It's more like a kind of inability in a way. You know, it's a default position. If you can't occupy a relatively dominant state by virtue of whatever talents or proclivities you have, then the default position is to be relatively inoffensive. Aimless is not nothing. Aimless is bad. You know, because Nietzsche said, if you had a why, you could bear any how. Right? If you just had a point and an aim, it didn't really matter if there was a lot of burden and trouble with it. But if you don't have a point and you don't have an aim, then there's almost no hope. And I mean that technically, because the part of your brain that produces hope is dependent on goals. And so if someone's really aimless, which is, you know, fairly characteristic of at least, you know, some reasonable percentage of adolescents and young adults, it's difficult to derive any pleasure out of life. And that means that you don't have any real medication to use against suffering, perceived and real. And so I really do think that's a big issue. Young men are relatively rough creatures, and the part of him that reflected that wasn't very well developed and integrated into his personality, and so it kind of led a life of its own, and it was really occupying his fantasies. You know, and you could say in a way what was happening was that his unconscious mind was dwelling on this violence because it had noted, so to speak, that his normal persona was too ineffectual. This was something that Alfred Adler in particular commented on. You know, he said that, and Jung as well, he said that as a personality develops a pronounced tilt in one direction, there's an equivalent tilt in the other direction, so it's as if the person is strung out between two extremes instead of meeting in sort of the Aristotelian golden mean. And I think your comments on the saccharine aspect of his personality are very much relevant in relationship to the vitriol, because the saccharine is false and overplayed and too much, and so is the vitriol. And you think, well, if he would have been a little less nice when he was being nice, maybe he wouldn't have had to be quite so horrible when he was being horrible. These things happen incrementally, and they're hard to look at. People are very much motivated not to see them. And so if you haven't seen it already, the probability that you're going to all of a sudden wake up and see it is not that high, because you've already been ignoring something that you shouldn't have been ignoring for a long time. You know, which is, I would say, you know, and this is obviously an inference and maybe it's wrong, is that the mere fact that his mother could say, I didn't see anything, you know, out of the ordinary, merely meant that she didn't know what ordinary should be. If things aren't going well for you, either you're wrong in some really profound way, or the world sucks. Well, take your choice, right? If you're wrong, man, you got a lot of work to do. You've made a lot of mistakes, and all of the consequences of those mistakes are lying around you, littering up the place. You got to go fix them all up. It's a long climb back. But if the world is out of kilter and, you know, it's composed of error in its fundamental essence, then you're obligated to go out there and do something destructive. I think you see a situation in which the drive for status is so overwhelming that the desire for survival is attenuated. And if you add to that a certain amount of hopelessness and a certain amount of resentment and bitterness and a certain amount of suicidal ideation, then, I mean, people will commit suicide. And it's not that uncommon. So I don't think it's that difficult to, you know, hypothesize circumstances under which the drive for status would be so paramount that it would overwhelm every other concern. It only has to happen for one day, right?